Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a very special broadcast of Invasion of the Alien Plants. A little talk on invasive plant species and their impacts on biodiversity. By me, Chris. This talk was put together for Westmeath County Council by Flynn, Furney Environmental Consultants. So in our talk today, we're going to cover a couple of different topics. First of all, a bit of background on alien and invasive species and what the difference is between the two. Then I'm going to go over some common invasives that you're likely to see in Ireland, some of the not so bad ones, and then the more serious ones. Then we're going to take some time to talk about Japanese knotweed, everyone's favorite. Before a brief overview of some aquatic invasive plants, before finally wrapping up with some actionable steps that we can do to work against invasive plants. Oops. So, is this plant alien? Is it invasive? Is it both? The gardeners among you might recognize this as a potato, which, despite Irish connotations, comes from Peru and Bolivia. And an alien species is any species that's not native to an area, unfortunately relegating our potato to alien status. But it's not invasive. Not all aliens are invasive. What makes a species invasive is that usually it has some sort of deleterious effect on the local flora or fauna, and they can spread in a number of ways, because being an alien, it doesn't come from here. How does it get here in the first place? There are three main ways. The first is natural spread, and in terms of plants, a lot of them are insect pollinated or wind pollinated. Bits of fruit and seed can be carried by animals. There's this one type of tropical rainforest bean that seed pod flows down a river for hundreds of kilometers before reaching the sea, and it's been known to cross the Pacific before growing again. But that is by far and away an exception. Normally, natural spread won't take a species far outside of its native range. And that's where we come in with intentional and accidental spread. This very attractive fellow here on the right is the cane toad, native to Latin America, but introduced into several different parts of the world, notably Australia. In 1935, they were sitting around scratching their heads, wondering what to do about all their cane beetles that were eating all their sugarcane, and some bright spark had the idea to introduce the Latin American cane toad. Encantado, Senor Cane Toad. Nice to meet you. We're gonna introduce you, and you're gonna eat all the cane beetles. Unfortunately, the cane beetles live about 3 foot up in the sugarcane, and the toad can't jump that high. So they immediately lost interest and proceeded to start eating their way through the Australian wildlife. And since then, their population has reached over 200 million. And they have devoured millions of native animals. A cane toad will eat anything that it can fit into its mouth. And unfortunately, they're not predated by native animals because they're poisonous, unless you're a cane toad, because cane toads are immune to cane toad poison and will in fact eat other cane toads. The slightly more slender fellow above him is the brown tree snake, which hitched a ride on an American troop transport plane to Guam, unbeknownst to the troops. And after passing through customs and the mandatory 14-day quarantine period, the snake disembarked onto the island, where it proceeded to eat many of the birds. And there were no snakes on the island beforehand, and so the birds didn't even know what a snake was. More importantly, they didn't know that a snake is a thing to be avoided. Methods to try and combat the snakes include just straight up shooting them, or my favorite one is parachuting dead mice full of a lethal dose of paracetamol down onto the island in the hopes that the snake will eat them and die. Some very clever fellow had the idea of introducing the cane toad to Guam, and thank God he was vetoed on that one. The Australians do not have a great track record in terms of ecological management. If you're looking for a good laugh, Check out the Great Emu War of 1932, which involved over 10,000 rounds of spent ammunition. Why are invasive species a problem? Well, in the case of animals, most of the time they eat local biodiversity. Plants do something a little bit different. Most of the time, it's to do with over competition. So an invasive plant will move into an area, it'll grow really quickly, and it'll crowd out the other plants. It might use up an unfair share of the resources, or more often than not, it'll block the light. And so any plants underneath it don't have enough sunlight to produce food, and they die off. So first of all, some common invasives around Ireland. And I'm looking at the gardeners again because yes, this is Buddleia, and yes, it is invasive. Um, Also known as butterfly bush, Buddleia davidii, which comes from central China and Japan, is an invasive species. Again, it overcompetes, and it's a bit of a pain to remove because it can grow. You might have seen it on building roofs or in gutters or in like loose grouting because it can grow in kind of anywhere that there's something that even looks like soil. Buddleia will grow. Notably in brownfield sites, you might see it behind walls or behind fencing where a lot of earth has been cleared. It's a first colonizer. It'll come in, it'll grow really quickly, and before any other species can establish themselves. On the other hand, though, it's a really good source of nectar for butterflies, hence the name. Next up, we've got the winter heliotrope, Petacites fragrans, and you might see this guy along roadsides or riverbanks, the really dense lily-shaped leaves, and in the wintertime you might see these purple flower spikes called inflorescences. It comes from Mediterranean Europe. That's as far as I could narrow down the origin. Quite hard to pinpoint, but it's not that far away from Ireland, and as a result, we have similar species that are native here, such as butterbur or coltsfoot. Um, the heliotrope is an overcompeter. It grows quickly. It forms these really dense carpets. You've probably seen them around, but because it's similar to the likes of coltsfoot, it can exploit a similar niche. So anywhere that we might find a native variety, the heliotrope can grow too. Snowberry is one I wasn't particularly familiar with until recently. Its leaves kind of look like a bay laurel or a bay willow, but you'll recognize it because of these white fruits, the titular snowberries. It's from North and Central America, and again, it overcompetes. It blocks light. It forms these really wispy but thick stems. If you ever see this out and about, it's worth uh, pulling it back a little bit to look underneath, and I guarantee you it'll just be dark and there will be bare earth underneath because not even grass will grow underneath it. The berries, as lovely as they look, they're poisonous to humans, so hands off. Similar silver linings though in terms of the butterfly bush. They're a good food source for wild fowl such as grouse and pheasants. Ah, the cherry laurel. Oh, my cherry laurel, I hear you gasp. Yes, Prunus larisorasus is in fact an invasive species. But before you go out to start pulling up your hedging, it's only invasive in certain situations. It comes from Black Sea regions, and it's really a problem in woodlands where native trees like your oaks or your hazel or your ash, which grow slowly and take a break in winter because they're deciduous, they can't compete long term with cherry laurel because it's evergreen. So when they go dormant in the winter, the cherry laurel keeps growing, and like the others, it overcompetes. It blocks light. It's really hardy. It's tough to kill, and it's spread by birds who eat the cherries. So once it kind of gets into an area, it's really hard to get it out. And now moving on to the third schedule, which is an actual piece of legislation which kind of governs the invasive plant species that we have to work against, our list of enemies that should be removed when they're encountered. And first of all, we'll start with one of the heavy hitters, Rhododendron ponticum. If you've ever been down around southwest Cork or Kerry, you've probably seen this around, notably in the Killarney National Park. It comes from the Iberian Peninsula, where it's actually a protected species in some places. There's one area of Portugal where the only rhododendron around is relegated to like a 3 hectare patch of land that's fenced off and has no trespassing signs because it's really dry there. And the plant kind of struggles. It's in its natural area, but it's in balance. But the problem is if you drop it into Ireland where it's nice and moist and temperate, it kind of goes, ooh, lovely, and it takes off. If you've been to Killarney National Park in the summer, like you'll see the pink flowers everywhere, and it's become a huge problem there. And not only does it outcompete other species, like it forms really, really dark understories. I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, some tourists got lost for a few hours in the rhododendron forests. And the flowers produce a nectar that's actually toxic to some bee species, as if the poor bees didn't have enough on their plate. There are a couple of thousand of hectares of rhododendron in Killarney, and they have a management plan where every year, every couple of years, a lot of volunteers go in and they try to cut it back, and they cut the young growth down to the stem, and they spray it with weed killer, and then come back the year afterwards to make sure that it's gone. And yet that has to have this manual removal. It won't be eaten by native species, similar to the cane toad. I think the last time I checked, there was about 2,200 hectares of forest that are managed for rhododendron regularly. Although that was a couple of years ago. I don't know what the figure is now. Hopefully less. And if it's not less, they should perhaps revise their management plan. Next up, we've got the ice plant. This one you mightn't see that often. It's more common in the south, like kind of along the coast of Cork and Waterford and parts of Wexford. It's quite common in France, I believe, if you've ever been down along the Azure coast or in Brittany. And it comes from South Africa. And it forms these really, really dense mats, these monocultures where nothing else can grow. And it has this three-sided leaf. It's quite thick, like a succulent, and these bright pink flowers. On one hand, though, its fruit is an important food source for the black rat. On the other hand, though, the black rat is also an invasive species. So no silver linings here. Gunnera tinctoria, giant rhubarb. This is one of my favorites. It's so impressive. It's huge. You'll often see it on estate grounds, or if you've ever been around Achill, it's everywhere around Achill Island. It's poor Achill. It comes from Chile. It's also called Chilean rhubarb, and it has a neighbor called Argentinian rhubarb, which is a little bit smaller. It's also invasive, although to my knowledge, it's not here yet. So fingers crossed. Why is this one bad? Well, you can see by the huge leaves, it blocks a lot of light. Like look in this picture here underneath, it's so dark. And you can still see, like in terms of plants, even like a half reduction in light coming through will cause significant reduction in plant growth. So it's not going to be pitch black, but it's enough to stop native species growing. The seed spike that you see here, it's almost a meter tall in some cases and produces millions of seeds. So once it's in, it's in. You're not going to get all of these seeds, and they go into waterways and they get everywhere. The leaves are poisonous, unlike normal rhubarb, which is delicious. And the way this reproduces and grows is quite interesting. It has these things called rhizomes, which are halfway between a stem and a root. Imagine a horizontal stem that grows along the ground or just under the surface of the ground, and it can spread horizontally. So the rhizome will bury through the ground for a while, and then a new plant will spring up. But these rhizomes, being kind of roughly root-shaped, they're cylindrical. And sometimes they break off either through natural decay or weathering or wind or storms. And being cylindrical, they can roll. And often they'll roll downhill and what's usually at the bottom of a slope, a watercourse. And so they get into the watercourse and like a little forester's log, they float down and they can block drains or nearly worse, they can implant themselves in the riverbank and grow into a new plant, and the cycle continues. Himalayan balsam is one of the plants like Japanese knotweed that you might see signs for, like Himalayan balsam here, do not cut, do not don't touch. Usually is the main one because of the seed pods. They when they dry out, they become very, very taut, and even the slightest touch will make them explode, sending seeds everywhere. Where does this one come from? The clue's in the name. Uh, why is it bad? Well, okay, well, apart from the obvious, it outcompetes and it blocks light, it produces a lot of nectar, which is good if you're a bee. It's great if you're a bee, loads of food, but it produces more nectar than surrounding native plants. And so it makes them less appealing because the bee is already full of nectar by the time it's done with the balsam. The other plants don't get a look in, and so they don't get pollinated as readily. It also contributes to bank erosion because every year it dies back, leaves the bank completely exposed. And in the wintertime, there's just more rain and so more flow through watercourses, and they can actually scrape away the bank. It's what we call a habitat engineer because it changes the environment that it's in. Another thing that's not super confirmed yet, it's more of an idea, is that this plant might be secreting chemicals either into the air or into the soil that actively inhibit neighboring plants. In its own environment, its neighbors will have evolved to combat these chemical weapons, and then the balsam will evolve new chemical weapons, and then its neighbors will evolve new defenses. It's kind of like an arms race. But the problem is when you lift up the balsam and you drop it into Ireland, native plants they're way behind. They've no idea how to compete with this, and so they've no chance to stand up to the potential poisoning of the balsam. Speaking of chemical weapons, actually that brings us on to giant hogweed, one of the coolest named plants ever, Heracleum mantegazzianum. And even though balsam and knotweed are two of the most famous, this is perhaps the actual one that's dangerous to people. Absolutely do not touch it. It comes from the Western Caucasus mountain area in Eurasia, and its sap is phototoxic, which means it's toxic in the presence of sunlight. The sap has a certain chemical compound in it that when it touches our skin, it deactivates our natural UV protection. And UV rays are quite strong, but fortunately we've got, the kind of an organic skin cream it's inbuilt into us. But this sap just switches that off. So the UV rays can damage our cells immediately. Like if you get splashed by this and you go out into the sun, within minutes you'll start to blister. And it causes phytophotodermatitis, which is perhaps one of my favorite words in the botanical sphere. It looks like regular hogweed, but you will recognize it because it is huge. If you're ever walking along and you think, oh, that hogweed looks particularly large, alarm bells should start ringing and take a step back. On a lighter note, we've got the American skunk cabbage, Lysichiton americanus. I struggle with this name. If there's any botanical aficionados among you, I apologize if I'm butchering these names. Though, as they say, there's a right and a wrong way to mispronounce Latin. You get one guess as to where this one comes from, and if you get it wrong, you have to leave. Its leaves are huge. This picture doesn't really do it justice. They look kind of small, but it can grow up to 1 meter tall. And as a result, when they start to spread, they just cover the ground. Beneath them, no light gets through, and it's the same old story. And supposedly, they produce a bad smell. Now, I've given talks mentioning this before, and I always have to say, okay, I've only ever heard that they produce a bad smell. I've never actually seen these in Ireland, but I'm delighted to tell you that just recently, I went for a walk up Ticknock Hill near Sandyford, and I was walking along, and I thought at first I smelled badger, and then as I got closer, I thought I smelled dead badger, and then as I rounded a corner, I was immediately transported back to the one time I went to America and I encountered a skunk. And then I saw this big obnoxious yellow flower looking up at me. It's quite impressive, I must say, but it does not smell good. So if you're ever around Sandyford, eyes peeled, nose pegged. Brings us on to part five, and the meat and potatoes of the talk. Japanese knotweed, everyone's favorite invasive plant species. Known as Falopia japonica, formerly Raynautria japonica. This guy comes from Japan, and it was introduced into Europe in, I think, 1846 by a Dutch doctor who was staying over, I think, around Mount Fuji at the time. And he came back with a few bushels of this under his arm, and he brought it to his botanical friends, and he was like, check out this amazing plant that they have over there. It has these beautiful, gracious flowers in the high summertime, and it grows with great vigor. We can feed it to our animals. We can eat it. It's got medicinal properties. We can use it for bank stabilization. It's a good border. You know, we can grow natural fences with it. And everyone was like, "Wow, it sounds amazing. Let's plant it everywhere." And that was a terrible idea, uh, because it spreads. It gets everywhere. Now, I have to talk about this property that plants have called totipotency, where, similar to the Hydra of Greek legend, one part of a plant can split into many other parts, and it's down to a cellular level, where a root cell might turn back into a base cell and become a leaf cell, depending on the environment. I worked with potato plants for my undergraduate degree. I had to propagate 100 of them by cutting up the leaves and putting them into a kind of growth medium. And over time, part of the leaf would turn into roots, part of it would turn into stems, and then it would grow leaves, and it would grow again. And I would cut those leaves and create new plants. But when it produces this way, it's called vegetative propagation or asexual reproduction. It ends up creating clones because it's all the same material. There's no mixing of genetics, there's no sexual reproduction. And as a result of that, um, all the Japanese knotweed in Ireland is a clone of, I think, one or two female plants came into England, and from there they spread into Ireland. So it's not so much Japanese knotweed, it's the Japanese knotweed, because they're all, in theory anyway, genetically identical. Is it a threat to nature? Yes, it is. Like all of its other friends in the invasive species club, it overcrowds natives, um, and it can reduce species diversity. If you imagine a load of Japanese knotweed on a bank, that is kind of squashing out native species. If you've less native species, you're going to have less native flowers. If you've less flowers, you're going to have less insects. Less insects means less birds. And beyond affecting the biology of an area, it can actually affect the geography. It's also a habitat engineer in the same way that Himalayan balsam is. It dies back every year. It's technically a perennial, so it kind of withdraws back to the roots and rhizomes and then springs back each year. But when it dies back, it leaves these bare, exposed earth banks, and any rain or a river or stream can cut into these banks and wash them away. And that loose soil can either block drains, or it can mess up fish spawning grounds, and of course it can spread the knotweed even further. Um, and this rapid spread is particularly bad. Like that whole totipotency with plants thing. Technically, they can all do it, but a lot of them need very, very ideal conditions, and even then, only sometimes. Japanese knotweed is really, really good at this. So even like a piece of stem can turn into an entirely new plant, a fragment of leaf. That's why you see the sign saying "Do not cut," because by cutting it, you're actually creating more of them. But beyond that spreading from little pieces and fragments, it also spreads by rhizomes, the same way that the giant rhubarb does. They burrow through the ground and go out horizontally. So you might think you've killed part of it, and then it comes up 3 meters to the left because the rhizome underneath has spread it sideways. And on that, is it a threat to people? Yes and no. It's more so an issue for infrastructure. And we've all heard the horror stories, like a new hotel opens up, they open the front doors on the first day, and what are those bumps underneath the carpet? And they roll it back, and there's the Japanese knotweed looking up at them. It can burrow through wood and concrete, but it's not Superman. It normally exploits existing weaknesses such as a fracture in the concrete or a crack in the wood. It can come up through tarmac. It can come up through gravel, which don't offer too much resistance. Um, and because of all of this, it's become a bit of a poster child for invasive species in the British Isles anyway. Um, and it's burrowed its way into the news several times in the UK. There's been a lot of court cases, mostly to do with making a site unmortgageable or unsaleable. It's even caused a murder at one point. They seem particularly fussy about their plants across the water. Another fun thing to look up would be the ASBO that was created specifically for the growth of Leylandia hedging. Um, Knotweed is a pain to treat. It's hard to deal with because, like I said, if you cut it, it can grow back. So the typical way that it's treated is you wait until it starts to die back, and the above ground part in the winter starts to die, and then you inject its root with a herbicide as it's pulling itself back down to the roots and rhizomes. But even strong herbicide doesn't always work every time, and you might need repeat applications, and even then the site has to be monitored for up to 7 years. So that's why sometimes you might see a sign saying Japanese knotweed do not cut, but there's no knotweed to be seen. Moving away from terrestrial species into aquatic plants, and aquatic invasive plants, of which there are many. In fact, of the third schedule, 18 of the 32 plant species are aquatic. I won't go into too much detail here because they're quite hard to identify. A lot of them look like a native analog, or a lot of them look like each other. Like I could show you slide after slide of New Zealand pygmy-weed or curly-leafed waterweed, and they look the same. I've been studying plants for a couple of years, and even they look the same. And often you won't be in the water. You know, you'll be looking at them through the water, a couple of meters away. It's hard to tell which one is which, but they are still a serious problem because they spread over existing species, over plants, over the things like oysters and mussels, both water weeds and seaweeds. They can grow up into drains or pipes and block them. They can foul propellers, um, and as such, best practice is observed when you're in the water. You know, if you have any boating equipment or kayaking stuff, um, paddles, fishing gear, and you're moving it between lakes, it's a good idea. I think the recommended time is to let it dry for a month to 3 months. To the idea being that any plant material that's on the boat will dry out and die. But in some cases, it could even be better to get it steam cleaned. I know some garages offer steam cleaning at 60 degrees, and this will kill stuff like any spores of. There's a fungal pathogen called crayfish plague, which is devastating our local crayfish population. But the spores can survive drying. So even if you leave your kayak in the shed for 6 months and it's bone dry, and you put it on the water, the spores can wake up again. Um, and so yeah, so beyond drying, steam cleaning could be a good option if you're regularly moving stuff between water bodies. I know I've spent the last while talking about how bad and prevalent and how ubiquitous invasive plant species are here. But what can we do about it? There's one group that suggests we eat them. The self-called invasivores have taken it upon themselves to try and eat their way through invasive plants and animals. Um, you can eat Japanese knotweed when at the early shoots. You know they're kind of like a sour rhubarb, but it's illegal to cut it though, so that kind of rules that out. This guy here is tricorned leek, which is a very close relative to wild garlic. Unfortunately, it doesn't taste very nice. So eating them isn't really going to save us. The best thing we can do as citizens is to report sightings. Um, you learn over time to identify them, what makes them stand out. Um, and there are a couple of apps like the National Biodiversity Data Center app, or there's one called Report Invasive Plants. but a lot of these just record the location and they're not always acted upon. One of the best things to do is just call the local authority, which would be the county council, and say, hey, look, I found some giant hogweed, or I found some Japanese knotweed. Here's where I am. Could you send somebody out to take a look at it? At the stage we're at, we're really looking at control versus eradication. We're not going to wipe them out. I mean, if you've got something like giant rhubarb, which is producing millions of seeds, or Japanese knotweed, which could be hiding under the ground, or rhododendron that's hiding in the heart of a forest that humans haven't been to in years, we're not going to be able to get all of them. But in the absence of a cure, prevention is pretty good. And then again, you're looking at best practice. So, for example, if you're out on a hike or a walk in the woods, give your boots a little knock every so often. Just shake off some excess soil. You never know, there could be some plant material in there or seeds, and just to stop them spreading just further than they need to. Maybe avoid water courses as well. Don't if you're out hiking, don't walk through them. Don't jump over them, because again, any seeds in water can travel a lot faster than just on land. And yeah, okay, going around a stream might mean you spend a little bit more time in the woods, but sure, look, isn't that why you're out walking anyway? Some final thoughts. Is this just ecology in action? Species spread all the time, by a wind or water or animal dispersal. I mean, humans are animals too. Technically, that snake on a plane is animal dispersal. Although the issue is that it's happening faster than nature can react to it. Although there's no point hating on invasive plants too much. They are victims of circumstance. It's not their fault that they're here. We brought them in most cases, and they are quite beautiful. A lot of them are introduced because they're ornamentals. I mean, Japanese knotweed has beautiful flowers. Sometimes when I see a bank of Himalayan balsam along a river, I'm in two minds. On one hand, I kind of think it's like, oh damn, it's here too. But on the other hand, I see the bright pink flowers and the sharp leaves and the red stem, and it's quite a spectacle. And besides, for an ape who came from East Africa and is now all over the world to the extent that we're changing the climate, who's the real invasive species here? And us calling out Japanese knotweed is kind of like the pot calling the kettle black. And that's the end. Thanks for tuning in. I really enjoyed putting this presentation together. And a special thanks to Melanie McQuaid for helping to organize this. And I wish you all a lovely day.